So we will get started, and I would love to introduce our panelist, who is Andrea Vassar. I'll let her tell you more about herself and her role at the university, and we'll get started.
And good evening, everyone. My name is Andrea Vassar, and I'm the Executive Director for Campus Accessibility. I'm also the ADA 504 Coordinator, which means that I cover most of anything having to do with accessibility, including students requesting accommodations, everything from facilities to employee accommodations to digital access. All of that kind of falls under my portfolio and what I do. But tonight, I'm here to talk about the Goldman Center for Student Accessibility, because that is what you want to know about. And I'm going to share some information with you about the Goldman Center, and just answer any questions that you might have, and kind of walk you through how the accommodation process, how students request accommodations, and a little bit about who we are and what we do. So the Goldman Center for Student Accessibility is actually located in the Howard Tilton Library, which is a centrally located part of campus, which is great. We're in the basement of the library, and we're completely accessible via elevator. So if you're on campus and you're looking for us, we are located in the library. The Goldman Center is specifically here at Tulane to eliminate barriers, to advocate for inclusion, and to make sure that every member of our community has access. We recognize that our community is much richer when we are diverse, and we acknowledge that great minds think differently. And some of our students think a little differently, and they may need different kinds of support. So the Goldman Center is specifically here to help students with disabilities have access and support for their education while they're here at Tulane. Next slide. So I am, like I said, I am the Executive Director for Campus Accessibility. And I'm pleased to announce that the Goldman Center has actually been without a director for a little while. And so I'm pleased to announce we have an incoming new director who will be joining us in about a week. His name is Dario Bayardo. He could not be here today, but he wanted to join you. He's going to be the director for the Goldman Center for Student Accessibility. So he's actually going to be the person who is going to be working with your students, with the Goldman Center staff, and really be the point person on student accommodations. I serve a little bit of a different role in that I don't directly work with accommodation requests for students, but I'm here as a support for the Goldman Center, as well as a support for you and your students should you need to reach out to me. However, you know, the structure of the Goldman Center is that Dario will be the person who will be mostly working with your students and the Goldman Center staff. We're really excited. Dario comes to us from Loyola and has many years of experience in student accessibility, accommodations, and really we're so excited to have him join our team. It couldn't happen soon enough, but hopefully you'll get an opportunity to meet him at some point. Like I said, he'll be here within the next week. And so I'm excited for him to join my team. Next slide. So what does the Goldman Center do? So I'm going to kind of break it down a little bit. Our primary function is to provide reasonable accommodations for students with disabilities here at Tulane. So those reasonable accommodations, when we're talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is the act that the law that is in place to make sure that individuals with disabilities have equal access to programs and services. And we'll talk about that in a minute in the next slide. But we'll talk about what's reasonable in a minute. But reasonable accommodations fall into three categories. the primary category is academic. So academic accommodations, these are things like that your students may have experienced when they were in secondary education. Things like note-taking support, extended time on tests, alternative books or materials that either for a screen reader or for a speech-to-text software or text-to-speech software. So there's a variety of different materials that we can help provide. If someone's hearing impaired, this would be ASL interpreting or other kinds of support such as captions or captioning of course content, videos and things like that. It's a full range. And actually last year, when this presentation was given, someone said, is there a list of different accommodations? And there is not a list. It's a very individualized process. And the reason we don't have a list, I'm just kind of giving you some examples, is that every student is different. The interactive process that we go through is specific to your student. And we sometimes have to create accommodations that never have been a part of what we typically would deem reasonable. And we've seen some of that over the last couple of years with the pandemic. Things have happened that we didn't know about or we couldn't have anticipated. So we've had to be more creative, look at things a little bit differently. And so that's why we don't have a list. So it isn't one of those things where it's like, what accommodations does Goldman provide? It's more like we are looking to see what accommodations would be reasonable based on the student's disability, the courses they're taking, or the programs they're trying to access, and what does that look like? And it's a pretty creative process. Before I was the executive director here, I've worked many, many years as the director for disability services at Temple University, as well as a small liberal arts school called Washington College in Maryland. So I've done this work, for a long time, and I've seen the accommodations that we provide to students change over time as we have identified different challenges that individuals with disabilities have. So it's changed over time, and I would imagine it will continue to change. And so we do not have a list of academic accommodations that we provide through Goldman, but we have general categories and things that we do look at when we're looking at accommodations. Also, we work with residence life and housing to determine housing accommodations. Right now, we're kind of at the end of that process, and hopefully, if your student needed housing accommodations, then you should have hopefully already been working on that. But if you have not, then I will point you in the direction of how you get in touch with someone. But we're working on housing assignments for incoming students right now. So the Goldman Center works very closely with other campus partners to make sure that individuals with disabilities, our students, have access to the housing that they need. And this tends to be things like single rooms, or it could be accessible shower areas. It could be accommodation or placement on a first floor or in a residence hall that might be newer that has elevators. It's a variety of different things that, once again, we look at on a case-by-case basis. And depending on what's available, we do our best to make sure that all of our students with disabilities can be housed on campus as much as possible. Kind of hand in hand with housing accommodations are dining accommodations. It's another residential accommodation that Goldman Center works on with our campus partners. This is one where it has to do with meal plans, either modifying meal plans or making sure that students have access to kitchens, or it could be at the very end of things, it could be that they're excluded from a meal plan or the meal plan's waived. So that is something we work out on a case-by-case basis. Again, I say it all the time. because there is not one set criteria. Typically, the students who are in need of this accommodation or this set of accommodations are students with chronic health conditions that have to do with dining. So that's typically the students who might need those accommodations. The second thing, or the second area that Goldman works with is self-advocacy, is helping students to develop self-advocacy, to understand how to, the best ways to communicate accommodations with professors and faculty, how to understand their rights under the different ADA and Rehab Act laws, understand what those rights are, but then also what does that look like? What does that look like in college and university? Because a lot of times students, and families will come forward and say, it's my right to have this, but they may not fully understand what reasonable accommodations are or what can be provided according to the guidance that we have. So we work with students to help them understand a little bit about what those rights are, but what the responsibilities are as well, because what we're trying to help students understand is how to advocate for themselves throughout the time they're here with us at Tulane, but then also eventually they're going to leave us and they're going to go into the workplace, and they may need accommodations when they go into the workplace. So it's one of those things where it's kind of practicing for how do you communicate your needs and your challenges and your needs to someone so that you can get the accommodations that you need, so that things are provided for you so that you have that equal access to all the programs and services that we have. So that's a big part. And how do we do that? Well, a couple of different ways. In August, we will have orientation for incoming students. We also have a peer mentor program where we have students helping other students with self-advocacy. And then every conversation that one of the accessibility coordinators here in Goldman has is surrounding this idea of self-advocacy. So every conversation, every time we interact with anyone, we are kind of teaching and guiding as we go, as things arise or as we work through accommodations. We're communicating this. It's a big part of what we do, and it's really an integral part of the work that we do in the Goldman Center, is to kind of have every opportunity to help students grow while they're here with us and realize that, the best ways of getting what they need. We also have disability-related learning support. And I put it this way because we do actually have at Tulane, and I'm sure it's going to be part of some other program, we do have academic learning center and tutoring support. And actually, the good news about that is it's actually located in the same place where the Goldman Center is. So we're kind of all together down here as far as being able to, support students. So we do have a full range of academic supports and tutoring and a variety of different resources for all Tulane students. And I really like that model, because coming, from, a place of disability support, I like the idea that all students have access to the same kinds of support. But every once in a while, a student comes in with a unique challenge based on their disability. On the Goldman Center staff, we do have one person. We have a learning specialist. Her name is Dr. Sophie Hiss. And Dr. Hiss has been here for a couple of years, and she is a learning specialist. So we use her to try to work with students so that if they need disability-related learning support, then they have access to that resource. So it's things specific to learning that are disability-related. So it could be someone, a student with ADHD, they might need some extra support or some understanding of what the intersection of their disability is with the kinds of things that they're learning at Tulane. And students can actually make an appointment with Dr. Hiss and have conversations around learning support. But we also have other kinds of learning support around different kinds of assistive technology tools that maybe kind of go beyond what an accommodation would provide, and just general resources, so that students with disabilities have access to a full range of assistive technology and learning support. And so the Goldman Center does provide that, that learning support for students with disabilities who come forward and identify and register with, self-identify and register with the Goldman Center. So, okay. I see there's a question, but I'm going to hold questions to the end because I have an answer. Okay, so managing expectations. This is one of the most challenging things that students and their families have. The challenge is to transition to higher education in the post-secondary world. So in secondary education and in K-12, the focus is completely on student success. The law that governs K-12 is IDEA, so that law has been put in place to make sure that students with disabilities have a free and appropriate public education, and they have access to different learning supports, accommodations, individualized education plans, and those kinds of, in that realm of helping them to be successful, making sure that they're getting everything that they can out of the different course classes, making sure that someone's there to support them with homework, someone's there to help them with assignments and staying on track and making sure that they're successful. I know a lot about this area because my background is in special education. I was a special education teacher for 16 years. So it's an area that is near and dear to my heart, and I'm also very familiar with. So this is the full purpose of having these extra supports in secondary, in elementary and secondary, middle school and secondary, is to make sure that students go through their educational career successfully. So the challenge is that kind of overnight, in a way, when a student leaves that K-12 environment and goes into the post-secondary environment, the laws switch and they're considered adults under the law. So the law switches to the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's no longer a free and appropriate public education because students make the choice to go to university, go to college. So they move into the realm of the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So there's two different laws that govern the way post-secondary and higher ed institutions have to operate. And so those two laws are civil rights laws, and they what they do is preserve an individual with a disability, preserve their ability to be fully included and have equal access to everything everyone else does. So they're designed as civil rights laws, and they're designed to make sure that people with disabilities aren't excluded. They cover everything from education to places of public accommodation, to employment, facilities, all of the different things I mentioned that the Office for Campus Accessibility, which is my primary role, everything that's kind of institutional wide are covered under the ADA, all of those elements. So the way this changes, though, is that in K-12, the school, the teachers, the parents may have helped a student identify or have tested a student to identify them as a student with a disability. In post-secondary, the students must come forward and self-identify because under the law, they're considered adults, unless they're 17. But at that point, most students are turning into adults at some point, and that's kind of a whole different thing. And parents are a little bit more involved at that point. But students must self-identify. But that doesn't mean you as parents can't help. So your role is to help them to understand what's available to them, which is why you're here this evening, and help them to understand the process and guide them through, especially the next several months and the next, the fall semester, to try to make sure that things are lined up for them, that so that they're ready to make sure that they can have access to the academic programs. So the part that's different is we say, K-12 is about success, making sure that students successfully, complete their education. But in post-secondary, it's about access. Are they able to access the programs? Are they able to participate effectively? It doesn't necessarily mean that their accommodations are going to support a certain grade or a certain outcome or a certain score on an exam. It doesn't work like that. If the student's reasonable accommodation is all about, if their reasonable accommodation is extended time on an exam, and they're given extended time on the exam, then they've been given the appropriate access. It doesn't necessarily mean that that extended amount of time will have an impact on how successfully they complete that assessment. So that's kind of how it's different. So this gets to the point of what's reasonable. So this is a little bit challenging, and I don't want to waste too much time on this or spend too much time on this, because it gets kind of into the weeds of what I do. But the most important one for families and for students to understand is that in order for something to be reasonable, it can't fundamentally alter the program or the course. And so it's at this fundamental level. So if we're changing curriculum, or we're completely changing assessments, that could possibly alter the way the course was designed. It could alter, it could at a fundamental level change the educational experience. This kind of analysis is kind of tricky, and there's a lot of conversation back and forth to determine what's reasonable. So for example, if a student came forward and requested, let's say, a modified chemistry exam, and I'm not talking about a chemistry exam in a different format. So if they needed a large format or they needed something digital, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about completely, let's say, changing a multiple choice test to an essay test or something else completely different than what is typically assessed, the way it's typically assessed. That conversation would be someone in the Goldman Center. It could be the professor. It could be someone in the department who's an expert. We don't make those decisions in isolation. A lot of times it's what we call the interactive process, and we go through the interactive process pretty extensively, and it's conversations, which is why in some cases accommodations aren't assigned, as quickly as you might imagine, because some accommodations require conversations. Another thing that would make an accommodation not reasonable is if the service is of a personal nature. So we don't provide personal tutors or personal assistants or personal devices, like we would not provide a wheelchair to someone who was a wheelchair user. Those are personal devices or personal services. And so those are things that the Goldman Center does not provide. The other one would be health and safety of others. So we would not ever grant an accommodation that could somehow impact the health and safety of someone else. And then there's the last category, which is administrative or financial burden. This one is one we don't normally get to, because we know what's reasonable within what we can handle administratively and what we financially, what Tulane has committed to making sure that students have what they need with regards to accommodations and access. So that kind of is the quick, the quick reason why something's the reasonable, how things work that way. But I'm happy to talk to anyone at length if they want to contact me, if they want to know more about that ins and outs of how the law works. Next slide. So what students do, we work with? Who do we work with? Who do we serve? Who is Goldman, working with? It's students who have a known history of accommodations. So if they had an individualized education plan, in secondary school, or they have some history of being accommodated in some way, then those are students we would work with. If students have a known history of academic challenges, whether they've been diagnosed or accommodated or not, because we know that some students, have newly acquired disabilities or newly identified disabilities. And so if they've had this history of academic challenge and they haven't necessarily been diagnosed or accommodated, we will also work with those students. And then, like I said, like I just mentioned, students with newly identified support needs. So if you think your student requires an accommodation and they didn't have one in secondary school or in their history, they still can come forward and request an accommodation. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about documentation in a minute, but they can come forward and we will work with those students. Next slide. So this is the question, and I apologize, this slide is very text heavy. I tend not to do that. I talk a lot, but I tend not to have text heavy slides. But this is the #1 thing that people want to know at this point. First of all, it's not too soon. This is exactly the right time to request accommodations, to have your students go through the process of requesting. Our access coordinators, we have several access coordinators on staff, and they are ready to work with your students. They're here, so they're here and they're ready to work with your students. So the first step is to go to the Goldman Center website, and we do most of this digitally. We have a digital database that's called AIM, that's accessible information management. So we have this database, which is where we keep track of all of the information with regards to students in a confidential way, everything having to do with their documentation, their requests, their tests if they take them with us. All of those things are kept in a digital database. I should also mention, I don't know, everything that we keep in Goldman is separate from their educational records. So sometimes students are, especially students who are, extremely, ambitious and concerned about people knowing about their accommodations. It's confidential, but it's also not included as part of their academic record. So it's held separately. It's held here with us in a confidential way. So it wouldn't show up on a transcript or anything that's an official educational record. Anyway, okay, so the way that you request accommodations is you go to the Goldman Center website, and there's going to be a contact slide here in a minute. And that is accessibility.tulane.edu. And when the students go there, they can complete an online form that's called request accommodations. There's a button there, and they can submit supporting documentation. What does documentation look like? That's always a question. What does that mean? If your student had an IEP or had accommodations at the secondary level, then it was most probably be the assessment that was done in high school. So it would be the assessment. It would either be called a psychoeducational assessment, or it could be a neuropsychological assessment. So there's that assessment report, and that is what we would want to get. The reason we want that is because it gives us the most information that we can have about that student's disability. It's only one piece of the information that Goldman collects or uses in the determination of accommodations. It's only one piece. So if you're concerned about documentation, it's certainly fine to have a conversation with one of the staff over here about what documentation could possibly look like. We also have guidance under the student tab of the Goldman website that talks more extensively about what kinds of documentation that we will accept. But we typically get, most of the time, we'll get that kind of information. Sometimes if a student's disability is more of a chronic medical situation, so I kind of use, that's either chronic physical or chronic mental health. I kind of lump that together. I lump all that kind of together because they're chronic medical conditions. I don't like to separate mental health from medical because they're chronic medical conditions. So anyway, sometimes that is a letter from a physician. It could be a letter from a different kind of a healthcare provider. It could be from a therapist. There are guidelines, things, the person must be certified in the field. That must be, their field of expertise. So we're going to look for that information. Typically, if it's a letter from a physician, it's on the physician's letterhead. It's, signed by that physician. This hasn't happened recently, but a long time ago, when I first started doing this work, some physicians would send it on a prescription pad. We don't take that. A little bit too informal. So it's typically a letter. It's a letter that talks about the diagnosis. We also need information about the impact of the diagnosis. And then we need information about possible recommended accommodations. Just because a healthcare provider or a different kind of diagnostician recommends an accommodation doesn't necessarily mean it will be determined to be reasonable while they're in university, because sometimes these recommendations could be more of a general nature, and then we would go back and look at those things that make something reasonable. And it's possible that a recommendation that was made is not a reasonable accommodation, but we would have that conversation with your student about that. So we want as much information as possible. And that's what we're looking for. And like I said, if you go to the Goldman website, you will see under the student button, there's also information about types of documentation. So once the student, your student requests accommodations, they're going to get an email from goldman@tulane.edu to schedule a welcome meeting. A welcome meeting is what we do where we get the information from the students. So I told you documentation is just one piece. The other piece, the most important piece in my opinion, is the student's description of their lived experience, their narrative, what they've experienced in their life, what their challenges are, what being accommodated looks like to them. So this welcome meeting, this conversation is really one of the most important parts. Even in my estimation, it's really the thing that guides any kind of accommodations that we would provide to students or approve for students. So then the student is going to attend the welcome meeting to discuss the request with one of our staff members, our accessibility coordinators. And that's what I told you, that part of that interactive process for determining accommodations. So once that welcome meetings happen, then we process the request. And what that means is that we put the accommodations in our system. We formulate accommodation letters, and then those things would be ready for students to then provide to their faculty. This typically can take, a couple of days to, it's 48 to 96 hours. It takes a couple of days for us to get all of that processed. Then there'll be an accommodation determination email that will go out to the students saying your accommodations have been, approved and arranged. And then after they're approved, then the students have to activate their accommodations through this portal, and all this will be explained to them during the welcome meeting. And then if they are a student that uses extended time tests, then those tests are then scheduled through our AIM system. And typically at this point, because it's June, just today it's June, students aren't registered for classes yet. So this is something that happens, in August, September, that kind of timeline. But that's kind of how the process works, from requesting to getting. So in this particular, you references the student rather than the parent, and your accommodations references for the student. Okay. And I pulled this information off of our website. I tried to change all the yous and yours, but I think I missed a few. But it's really guided toward the student. Like I told you, the whole process is guided toward the student. So anywhere in this document that says you or your, it's referencing the student, not the parent. Okay, so where am I? All right, so after they're approved, then the Goldman Center will help students to understand how to send their letters to their faculty. This has to happen and has to be initiated by students before the faculty member will have an awareness that there is an accommodation. So looking at this process, I'm going to tell you typically where things kind of break down. A lot of times parents are encouraging, hey, do your accommodation request, and where it breaks down is sometimes the students don't schedule the welcome meetings. And then weeks go by, and then someone's like, how come you don't have accommodations? It's because that welcome meeting never happened. It's really an important part. The other place it kind of breaks down is after the accommodations have been approved and they get the accommodation determination email, they fail to activate their accommodations and send those to the faculty. So those are two places where it would be really great for the Goldman Center staff if you can help support that, knowing that these things are going to come, making sure to help support your student and remind them to, make sure they follow up on these things, because those are the two places that I've seen over the years that things kind of break down. The communication kind of breaks down. So that would be really helpful for you all to help us with that, to make sure that the students complete the interactive process. Next slide. So how do you contact the Goldman Center? Accessibility.tulane.edu, which is what I already told you. And the email is goldman@tulane.edu. And you can also call us. We're here all summer. The phone number is 504-862-8433. That's our main line. And so any questions you have about your specific student, you really should email goldman@tulane.edu and start working with a coordinator who then reach out to someone. So this is how you contact everyone. And I'm coming up on time for questions, Penny. I've tried to leave at least 15, like let's say about 20 minutes left for questions, and we have a few. So if you have questions for me, I covered a lot of information, but I'll answer the questions. Penny and I'll work through the questions we already have. But if you have other ones, please type them into the Q&A and we'll do our best to answer them.
Okay, so a question is, are there specific advisors who work with students with learning disabilities, i.e. when they're doing their course selection, or if so, how does the student request one? So I know you touched on this.
Right. So no, there's not a specific advisor. So students, and we have an assistant, we have, four accessibility coordinators, and Goldman's not set up on a case management model. So we don't have a coordinator assigned to a student. Students can work with any of our coordinators at any time, but they're not academic advisors. They're coordinating accessibility accommodations. So if a student has a question about course selection, they need to go through academic advising, because this is really important. We don't want to give students misinformation. Tulane has a lot of wonderful programs, and there's no way that we can know all the ins and outs of all of the different academic programs. We don't want to give students the wrong information about prerequisite classes or what's required for a major. That really isn't our role. Our role is to help students understand their disabilities, help them get accommodations, and provide some learning to support. And I talked about Dr. Hiss earlier. So there is someone to work with a student in a specific way, but it has nothing to do with academics as far as course selection. It would be academics as they relate to an accommodation.
Okay, so another person said that the psychological test or assessment for their student was done in 2018. So is that something that is that far back still considered valid?
Yes. Most disabilities kind of could change over time, but if you are a student with a learning disability, it's unlikely that now all of a sudden you're not a student with a learning disability. So yes, there used to be many years ago requirements where either 3 years or 5 years, they weren't valid. The assessments are always valid, and Goldman will take that assessment unless there's some new diagnosis or new disability that isn't talked about. We'll still take that documentation, but we may need additional documentation. So it's really, once again, case by case. I worked with someone whose documentation had been lost in a fire, and they had documentation from middle school, but not high school. I worked with that student. We will work with what we have, but I will give you this caveat. If your student is going for high stakes testing at some point after they leave Tulane or they decide to go into a graduate program, those graduate programs have very strict guidelines about the age of the documentation. So those are normally anywhere from 3 to 5 years, things like the GRE, those kinds of different kinds of more formalized tests. So it's possible that the student may have to be reassessed at some point so that documentation is of the appropriate age. Because what will also happen is sometimes those high stake testing companies will contact ETS, or someone will contact the Goldman Center, and then we have to fill out a form that certifies that the student's documentation is 3 to 5 years. If we don't have that, then we can't certify that. So that's just something I mentioned. Unfortunately, if it's a 3-year requirement, if a student is even assessed as a senior in high school, that may not be valid by the time they're going to grad school. So I just like to tell you that if you have documentation from 2018, that's completely fine. And we would be working with you with that documentation. And if you have no documentation or you're working on getting documentation, don't wait. Contact the Goldman Center, because it's really important that we start the conversations. And in some cases, if you're waiting for, let's say, the report to come in, or there's something that's holding something up, we could possibly provide interim accommodations or provisional accommodations while we're working. So we don't want you just to wait till you have everything. We want you to come forward. We want your student to come forward to request accommodations.
Okay. The next question is, do students need to request a specific accommodation, or can specific accommodations be recommended by a Goldman staff member after reviewing the documentation and meeting with the student?
Both. So there will be some recommendations and some more standard accommodations, but having, like I said, done this work for a long time, during the conversation, they may not have ever asked for, let's say, assistive technology, but I'm hearing what they're telling me. And I say, well, wait a second, do you think, digital books would be helpful? Do you think, I start describing things and how they work, and this kind of note-taking support, or this kind of technology, where they might not have thought about it. Or maybe, they talk about processing speed. And I said, well, do you struggle when you're writing an essay exam? And if you do, maybe you can type your exams instead. Or there's all kinds of things that are part of that conversation. So that's why it's really important. Those welcome meetings are the most important part, because that's when those conversations happen. So yes, students could request a specific accommodation, and then we would see if what they're requesting is reasonable. Most of the standard accommodations, note-taking services, and extended time on tests and things are been determined to be reasonable over time. But more, we would be looking at different accommodations if there's something that's a little bit more unusual. But we also recommend things.
Okay, there are a couple other questions, kind of recap some of the procedures that you mentioned. So, so they find the request accommodations button on the website. That's accessibility.tulane.edu, correct?
Yes.
I think it's on the right side of the screen, isn't it?
Actually, if you go to the Students tab, that's where you need to do requesting accommodations. And there is an accommodation button right there, or there's accommodation link. At the top of the website, it says request accommodations. You click on that. It's not really a button. It's more like a menu item. Sorry if I misspoke.
Will the welcome meetings be virtual over the summer?
They can be. So we can either meet with someone in person or we can meet virtually. One of the better things to have come out of the pandemic is to give students better access to our services and to our staff. So absolutely, we can do a welcome meeting on the phone. We can do it via Zoom. We can do it in person. I would imagine most of the summer meetings until August will probably be virtual, and that's fine. We do this all the time.
Next question. Can you please talk about disability-related learning support services that are provided?
So this is the way that Dr. Hiss works with students, is to help them understand a little bit about their impact of their mostly learning disabilities on their education. So it's kind of a more in-depth support than what we would do during a welcome meeting. It's more about having them understand. So one example would be having your students understand a little bit more about how their disability interacts with the learning environment, and making suggestions and coming up with plans and possibly making referrals to the other learning supports, making recommendations, those kinds of things. What it isn't tracking assignments or, those kinds of things. It could be regularly scheduled meetings with Dr. Hiss, over time, like maybe every several weeks, or checking in meetings. It could be that. But what it's not going to be is having someone really go through coursework. It would be more about general understanding of how the disability interfaces with learning. So here's an example. Sometimes students who have mental health challenges may have a diagnosis of, let's say, generalized anxiety disorder, may not understand fully the cognitive impact of when there's symptoms of that particular disability, when things are happening, when they're having an episode with anxiety. They may not understand that. What we know, based on having worked with people and knowing all about, these different disabilities, is that there's a huge cognitive impact for these students. It's what we typically hear them say, shut down. So what do we do about that cognitive impact? Those are the kinds of conversations that would be having with the learning specialist. Excuse me.
Are there additional services, for example, tutoring, that are available for a fee?
No, the Goldman Center does not have any additional fee-based programs. Some institutions do, and I'm familiar with them, but at this time, we do not have fee-based support services through Goldman.
Now, under the umbrella of Newcomb-Tulane College, there is a tutoring center. And so there are students who are they apply to be tutors. They have to demonstrate that they've made good grades in the subjects that they are tutoring. I think they have to have faculty recommendations, and they offer tutoring. And some of those things are sort of regularly set up, scheduled tutoring for particular subjects or particular courses. And then others, they can sort of, I think, make appointments with particular student tutors. And that is all free at Tulane. So, so there is tutoring that's available. There certainly might be people in the New Orleans community that offer tutoring for a fee, or some students who might independently do that. But I would say have the student always check with our tutoring center to see what is there first. And another thing that we mentioned last night in the advising and course registration webinar is that we also, for some of the courses, have this really great feature that's called supplemental instruction. And that is, for some courses, there is a student, again, who's had faculty recommendations, they've demonstrated success in the course, and they lead these optional supplemental instruction sessions. And that the benefit of that is that they've taken the course, they know how to communicate student to student, they can guide them. So you can kind of think of them as like super study sessions, you know, instead of just people in the course who are all learning the material, getting together to study together. That's led by somebody who's already been successful in learning that material. So not all courses have them, but a lot of the STEM courses do at that general entry level kind of point, first year kind of classes. And the professor will usually list the whether or not there's a supplemental instruction feature in the syllabus. So it's, and that's getting more at that subject matter guidance and tutoring. That's different from what Andrea was just talking about helping a student understand their disability, and you know, where it's understanding how that applies to a lot of different things instead of being subject matter specific. So I'll just mention that that is another thing that is on offer. So here's another question. Once a student gets approved for accommodations, are those put in place for all 4 years, or does the student have to reapply each year for their accommodations?
It's all 4 years. The only time that a student might, you know, request different accommodations is if there's a new diagnosis or an additional diagnosis, or there's a diagnosis, or there's some kind of acquired disability that happens during the time that they're here. So they don't have to reapply, but what they do have to do is activate their accommodations every semester because the faculty change. So those accommodation letters at the beginning of the semester have to be sent out to the faculty because that's their notification that your student has accommodations. If we've done everything in Goldman, that's another one of those places things break down. If we've done everything that we can with them, but they don't send their letters to their faculty, we don't automatically notify them. Why? Because that's that self-advocacy piece. We don't notify them because it also they're considered adults and they may not want a certain professor to know they have accommodations. Okay, you know, we may not like it as parents, but let's say they're concerned about a major course or something at some point, and they are like, I don't need accommodations for this. I don't want them to know. We're not going to go around them and notify someone. So that's why it's important that they activate their accommodations and send those letters out through the online system every semester.
So getting back to that discussion about the documentation that would be submitted and how long it's valid for, could you just clarify, if they had that documentation from, say, high school, and they submit that, would that be valid for all 4 years at Tulane?
Yes. Like I said, the only thing that we might request additional documentation if something changes and we need more information.
And you were just wanting to give them sort of early alert that that time.
Yeah, I was just saying, be aware that we might not require it, but somebody else down the road could.
Right. If a student has a learning disability but wants to start out at Tulane without accommodations, can that student later ask for accommodations if she finds that she needs them? So what would you recommend about this situation, Andrea?
Yes, because a student can request accommodations at any point in their academic career here at Tulane. However, if I've been a parent of a university student, please encourage your student to go ahead and come forward and request accommodations and have the conversation. If they don't want to go any further than that, they don't want to send letters, and they want to try it on their own, great. Because what will happen is if they wait, and typically, just in my experience, having worked with a lot of first-year students, that's going to happen around midterms. Then they have to go through the whole process, which could take time, right? So if they go through the process on the front and never use accommodations the whole time they're here, that's fine. We're not going to be sending anything out to anyone. or doing anything until they activate their accommodations. So if it were me and I was a parent of a student needing accommodations, I would try to encourage them to go forward and do this, and then let them know that they're still in complete control about when they use them. They're in complete control not only of whether the letters go out, but let's say they have extended time on exams. It's at a granular level, so they can choose to take extended time for exams in one course or one exam, or none of the courses, or it's all kind of up to them how they want to do that. And I didn't mention this, but the Goldman Center actually has a testing center attached to it, and that's where most students take their extended time tests here down in the Goldman Center. It may not, they don't have to, but in some cases, because of the size of the classes, the faculty member would encourage them, because they don't have another way. If they need extended time, the faculty member may not be able to provide the extended time, so they'd have to take it down here in Goldman.
Right. So there might be another class that meets immediately after that.
They might not be able to do that, right?
So they can't extend the time in that room.
Right.
So you've got that space.
But that's why we have a testing center.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a couple of questions about, what exactly is offered in the Academic Learning Center and the tutoring. So when I send out the follow-up email to all of you, I'll put the link to that so that you and your student can explore what's there. They will definitely hear about that in orientation at the beginning when they get here in August. They can find information on the web. There will be outreach that it's done by that center, and as Andrea said, they're kind of co-located with the Goldman Center. And she's mentioned down here a few times, and that's because they are in the basement level.
I said at the beginning, this is where we're at. We're in the basement of the library, which is a great central location.
Right.
You know what? Students come into the library, so they come in.
Yes,
there's no reason they can't come downstairs.
Yeah. So so there'll be several opportunities to learn about those. In fact, it's also one of the things that the peer mentors who are attached to the first year seminars mention as they go through the semester with the students in that class. They have a bit of time in each class to remind students of these resources, and then they've been trained on them, so they're also available for students to ask questions of if they have forgotten all of this. There's a lot for them to learn about in coming into this new environment. It's a very resource-rich environment, but keeping track of all those can kind of be, a lot to do when they first arrive. So we definitely do a lot of outreach and reminders and e-newsletters that go out to new students, especially, to just highlight those different resources and keep them abreast of that. So I'll definitely put the links to those. And we may have another webinar later this summer that'll address some of those things that are offered in that sort of tutoring and student success support. So watch for those in the parent e-newsletter. There's another question. Oh, and I just wanted to mention that the students would also have to activate those accommodations every semester, right, Andrea? Since their courses change from semester to semester, they have to do it every semester. Every semester.
But if they decide, the question is, if they decide they don't want to use them, it's completely up to them. They can choose to send letters or not send letters, or use accommodations or not.
But I will just echo what Andrea said, that this summertime is definitely when the staff in the Goldman Center is focused on those welcome meetings and reviewing the accommodation requests. And it's just so much better to go ahead and do that now and then elect not to use them than, like she said, the student waits until then it's sort of at a crisis and they realize they must have those, and they haven't already gone through that process. And so that's why we make this one of the very first webinars of the summer, to alert all of you parents to that, so that you can guide your students to take those steps, learn about all of those things, and kind of initiate the process. So the last question, I believe, is, will I send out the letter with a recap and the links today? I usually wait to do that until I have I get the recording of the webinar back. from our IT department. Andrea, since you've got your computer open, could you just look that up and maybe we can read that to them, what that link is for the Academic Learning and Tutoring Center under Tulane College? Give us just a second. And I would say, if you have any last questions, then submit those now. If you have any comments that you'd quickly like to send us or feedback, then you're welcome to do that now. And you're always welcome to send feedback to parents@tulane.edu. And if it's specific feedback about that webinar topic, I'll forward it on to my colleague, who is the panelist for the webinar. If you have suggestions for other topics or just feedback about the webinar series in general, then I'm very grateful to get that feedback from you. So did you find that, Andrea?
Yeah, it's success.tulane.edu, Academic Learning and Tutoring Center.
So I put that in the chat. I hope everybody can see that. We'll repeat it, success.tulane.edu. You may have to use some drop-down menus to get to tutoring, but I would say, explore that
Well, if you scroll down, it's like peer tutoring, supplemental instruction, writing center, math center. It's all the information.
All there.
And these are wonderful resources.
You have to scroll down to find those different links and sections.
So if you have a specific question on your specific student, please email goldman@tulane.edu. If you want to get a hold of me, just because you do, I'm pretty easy to find. My name is Andrea Vassar. It's Vassar, V as in victory, ASSAR. So I'm A Vassar @tulane.edu. Sometimes people make the mistake and they do Vassar ER, but it's Vassar with an AR. So it's A Vassar @tulane.edu if you want to ask a specific, more general question. But if it's specific to your student, it would probably, because what'll end up happening is if you email me, I'm gonna give it to someone at Goldman. So, but if you just feel the need to want to talk to me, feel free to email me.
Well, I think that's all the questions. So I'll thank Andrea so much for providing all this valuable information. And thank you to parents for tuning in and being interested in this. And we appreciate the support that you're giving your student by also kind of getting oriented to the resources that we offer and help them in this early phase of their transition to the university, so they can make those requests and get things set up to be as successful as possible. So thank you so much, everyone. The next parent e-newsletter will go out in a couple of days, and there will be an announcement of some additional webinars coming up on other topics, so watch for those. And I also wanted to mention that one of those webinars later in the month will be given by Dining Services. So they will also explain the program that they have within the dining options that is built to accommodate students who have specific allergies to different elements in food. And so there are a lot of things that they can accommodate with their normal program and the menu options that they create all the time. So that may be of interest to you if that wasn't possible at your student's school earlier. So keep that in mind. That one will be on Tuesday, the 28th at 6 o'clock. So if you want to save that date, then that could be smart. And then you'll get the registration link in another e-newsletter. So with that, then I'll close everything and thank you again for attending. Good night.